glasses over there.
When young Dan Hill, from whom you heard earlier this morning, set out to write his book about his father, he called me and we had an interview. And he asked me, he began with a very interesting question. He said, why did you and my dad become such good friends? And you know, that's a hard question often to answer. You go through much of your life friendly with people, and you never stop to think, why the hell are you friendly with them? And when he put the question to me that way, I had to think it through. And the answer I finally gave him was because your father was one of those unique people. He had his head in the clouds, but his feet on the ground. He was a practical idealist. On the idealist side, he never took his eye off the ball. He knew what it was he wanted to accomplish, and that was ever before him. On the practical side, he had all kinds of savvy as to how to bring it about. The characteristics that he used during his lifetime as an activist, he was aggressive, innovative, imaginative, and finally he had a sound sense of perspective. Aggressive. When Dan first became the first director of the Human Rights Commission, prior to that time, the human rights legislation was enforced on a part-time basis by part-time officials of the labor ministry. Dan took it over and suddenly started to publicize what it was the commission was all about, so that attracted complaints to him. He wanted to work, he wanted the action. And the number of complaints just shot up overnight. And that enabled him to get busy and make a difference in the lives of a lot of real people. But then, as he proceeded, he reached beyond complaint enforcement. He saw things and he wanted to respond to them. He set up a very interesting operation. He watched people try to negotiate the maze of government services. Most of the time they get lost, they give up in trying to get the help that the legislation had provided for them. Dan set up Services for Working People, a storefront operation in downtown Toronto that attracted people in the door and helped them negotiate the maze of government services, so that at long last they were able to get what the legislation promised to them. This is a way of telling me to dry up.
I can't win for trying.
Don't start with me.
It's not an equal fight.
No, it's not an equal fight.
And then the reverse of that, up in the North Country, where the Aboriginal people live, they were miles from any of the services they needed. Dan, with his imagination, came up with the idea of a Jeep, a human rights Jeep that went through the North Country, visited the reserves, and brought the services to the people. And then I remember there was a fellow who had denied a job to a black woman. He was an exhibitor at the trade fair, and he didn't hire her because of her color. And he was about to leave town, so we couldn't use the normal levers of pressure. We couldn't get her the job. The job was finished. And we started to negotiate with this guy, and we didn't have anything to use. I can admit it now. We didn't know what the hell we were going to do. And as we talked to the guy, we came up with the idea of trying to get some money out of him. The law at no time then provided for damages, but we thought it would be a good idea to get damages. I should tell you at the time, just to fill in one little bit of the background, I was working then for the Toronto Labor Committee for Human Rights. I was one of Donna's successors in that job. And we started to negotiate with this guy, and we came upon money, and he started reaching into his pocket, offering. And we said, no, not enough, not enough. And I can remember at one point, this guy just kept digging in and taking out more and more money. And I almost burst out laughing as to how easy it was to get money from that miserable son of a bitch. All the while, Dan kept a perfectly straight face. I was biting my tongue, ready to burst out laughing, and he must have been a terrific poker player, Larry. I never saw him play poker, but boy was he good in that session. And that set a precedent, and it was in the press. Money, damages, and of course we had no idea if we were behaving lawfully or not, but we got the money for the guy, and that was good enough. Subsequently, it was put into the act. And then he came up with another idea. When there was a human rights complaint went to a hearing, and he thought, well, these things shouldn't be played out to an empty courtroom. So he used to go around the community and organize the people in the community, particularly if there were blacks or aboriginals or whatever, who felt the problem. They showed up, and we'd mob the courthouse, we'd mob the courtroom, so that when the person who had committed the act of discrimination walked into the hearing room, he saw a hostile audience. And more than once, they surrendered after they just took a look at what was going on in the courtroom, said, all right. One guy I remember, and I particularly mentioned this, it was a situation in Chatham, where a guy refused to rent boats to blacks for fishing. What a black is supposed to do to a boat, I'm not sure, but he wouldn't rent to them. And we had a hearing, we had the courtroom packed with people, and in the middle of his cross-examination, while he was being cross-examined, the guy said, all right, I'll take them. You can imagine how disappointed we were. We had a courtroom filled with angry people, and this guy surrenders before he's supposed to. We went into the judge's chambers in the back to try to work it out, where we paid money. Black guys put money deposits down on boats. Some of them said they didn't like fishing. Dan told them they had to go fishing. So in the result, you had parties of blacks fishing at that place from that point till the end of the season. You see, Dan never took his eye off the ball. In Amherstburg, Ontario, a report of a Ku Klux Klan burning. Dan flew to the scene. He soon discovered that this was more mischievous than dangerous. There wasn't very much to it. A typical bureaucrat would have just packed his bags and gone home. A typical demagogue would have stayed on the scene haranguing the community and telling them of great dangers that didn't exist. But Dan was neither bureaucrat nor demagogue. He was a creative opportunist. He used the occasion against the backdrop of all that community feeling. He sat down with the mayor of Amherstburg, and they began to work out a program to find jobs for black kids where black kids had never worked before. He never took his eye off the ball. He also wasn't constrained by jurisdictional considerations. If he discovered a human rights problem beyond his jurisdiction, he found some way of doing something about it. He started to get reports in the 60s that the Canada Manpower Centers, as they were then called and then organized, were taking discriminatory job orders. This government agency were serving the interests of discrimination. As the director of the Ontario Commission, he didn't have the formal jurisdiction to do anything about it. So he came to me. I was the outside agitator. He told me about it and said, listen, let's do something about this. So we got people in about 6 or 7 communities across the country. This was so easy to organize. You know, sometimes modern day activists drive me crazy. How they make problems out of things that are so easy to, often so easy to resolve. We telephoned Canada Manpower Centers across the country, pretending that we were representing some firm that was about to locate in the community. And listen, will you screen out blacks and Aboriginal? We want to have whites only. And you should have heard the answers we got. So it's white and bright, eh? And this kind of reaction. In the result, we found that there were only 4 out of 21 we telephoned were not prepared to accept the discriminatory job orders. In 17 cases, they showed a willingness to accept them. We organized a community conference. At the conference, Dan and I did our role play act. Oh, it's so nice to tell these stories now. We had to keep them under wraps for so long. I stood up at this banquet and revealed all these facts. Of course, we had invited the press, so we had television there and everything, and I laid out the case. And then Dan stood up, shaking his head solemnly and saying, "Isn't that terrible?" Of course, he had gotten me to do the whole thing. And of course, the next day in Parliament, the MPs were jumping all over the minister about it, and reforms were adopted not too long after that. In Kenora, I was organizing a demonstration of Aboriginal people. And I was daily consulting Dan in Toronto about the tactics, what to put in the brief. We were back and forth all the time. But we came upon a problem. We wanted to have hundreds of people in this demonstration. We wanted to make a sensation. Well, they lived miles and miles from Kenora. Dan's imagination. He figured out, he was then the director of the Human Rights Commission, and there was an organization set up in Kenora at the time. It was called the Indian White Committee. And he steered money to them under an education rubric. They were going to promote education between whites and Indians, as they were then called, in the community. And he gave a big sum of money to the Indian White Committee, who turned around and chartered the buses for us so we could bring the native people in from the reserves. Well, there's an interesting punchline to this story. A Winnipeg Tribune reporter got the sense of what was going on between Dan and me at the time, and there was a headline in the old, now defunct Winnipeg Tribune newspaper. Major headline said, "Negro and Jew spearhead march by Indians." I understand Dan kept that on his refrigerator for many years thereafter. And of course, Dan and I had many laughs over that. As it outraged other people, it amused us no end. And finally, I come to perspective. You heard about his role in founding the Black History Society, his authorship of The Freedom Seekers. He was deeply immersed in the culture of his people. At the same time, however, he was very much a universalist. He was concerned about discrimination against all people. In fact, more than once, he said that as far as he was concerned, the Aboriginal people are the most worst treated minority in this country. And I remember very well his co-authorship of a piece in the Toronto Star at the time of the Showboat controversy, when there were remarks made by certain black commentators who made an issue out of the fact that some of the producers of Showboat were Jewish. And Dan tore a strip off those people for those anti-Semitic remarks. He was always prepared to go to bat for other people as well. In fact, in my 1999 book, The New Anti-Liberals, I dedicated it, and I can recall the dedication verbatim, to Daniel G. Hill, lifelong fighter against discrimination, for the way he combined devotion to the particularity of his black heritage with commitment to the universality of liberal values. When we celebrate the life of Dan Hill, we are also celebrating the best parts of ourselves. Thank you very much.